In this video, we're going to have a look at the typical life cycle that an Android app goes through. It's going to be important because the life cycle, whatever game we develop will be subject to that life cycle as well. And it means that there are certain things that we're going to have to take into consideration. Generally speaking, it's not major issues or not something that's majorly complicated. So the types of activities here would be things where the player suspends or pauses the game or puts something into the foreground on top of the game. And we want to make sure that we have hooks within our game that will act appropriately when that happens. So for example, pausing the game or suspending things or not taking certain activities if the player's not playing it. So there's a well-defined life cycle for an Android app, and you can see a brief overview on the screen. So at the top we have the activity starting, and down at the very bottom we have the activity ending. And generally speaking, we go through three phases that leads us up to it running, to being visible on the screen and running, and then three phases which lead us out from that to finally being discarded from memory. So in terms of the phases going in, we have an OnCreate phase, which then follows on to an OnStart phase, and then, rather confusingly, an OnResume phase, because if you're starting it for the first time, why would you automatically resume it? On the other side, we have an OnPause, OnStop, and an OnDestroy. And notionally these are paired, so that OnCreate is paired with OnDestroy, OnStart is paired with OnStop, and OnResume is paired with OnPause. And there is logic to this, it does make sense. So initially we will create our application, and eventually when it's finished we will destroy it. So when we're creating it, we're doing whatever startup things we need to do, we're constructing what it's going to look like, we're getting things ready to make it visible and to be in a state where we can commence running. And the notion of destruction is the direct opposite. We clear up after ourselves, so we get rid of anything that we need to get rid of. Start and stop then, this is where we're basically looking at it being an activity that is running, it's being processing, it's doing something, so we can start the activity, we can stop the activity. And for resume and pause, this is the difference between where it is active, or the users put something on top of it, so they can pause, they can resume it. And within the game we might have a pause and resume button as well, which we arguably could want to use through those calls too. Just by way of another diagram, again it's showing exactly the same process, this way just slightly different diagrammatically. So we come in over on the left hand side with the creation. When we create it, we can call the onStart method that moves us into the starting state. So we're visible at this point. We can then resume, which will sort of bring us into the running state. So again, the application's running. If we pause, we go to the pause state, so we're partially visible, and we can sort of iterate between pause and resumed. If we go into the stopped state, on stop, it's being called, then we're not visible on the screen anymore, but we're not necessarily being kicked out of memory. The user may want to bring us back. And should we ever be called OnDestroy, then we are out of memory. The thing's completely gone. Now, this life cycle, it applies to activities, it largely applies to fragments as well. So if I'm running an application and I have one activity and I go to another activity, each of those activities separately will go through their own life cycle. And if I'm using a fragment as part of those activities, those too will go through their own life cycle. So we're not necessarily talking about the whole application here. It can be if you have a single app, single activity, then that's just the life cycle. But if you have a more complex activity, or a more complex app with different activities, different fragments, each of them will have their own, if you like, life cycles. So let's have a look at some demo code to illustrate this. And this will be sent out as available from Downloading Queens Online. We're going to be looking here at one of the demos, and it's Lifecycle Test. We have an activity file, and we have a fragment file. And we want to basically just explore to see how they work and what happens. I'll run them first of all. So we'll fire this off and we'll have a look to see at the messages that are going to be displayed. Effectively, this when it runs will have a an activity that has a fragment, and the fragment simply going to display a large text view. And to that text view, we're going to add in basically some messages telling us what particular state that we're in. So this is the emulator is visible on the screen. Now I've because I'm going to display sort of reasonable amount of fine text, I've increased the size of the emulator, so I'm not seeing the whole thing here. But I'm going to click on Lifecycle Test, and that will then fire off this particular demo. So it's an activity fragment inside it, and you can see there are some messages that have been created, and basically we're going to have hooks into each of those methods, the on start, on create, on pause, on resume, and whenever they're called we'll log out that yes, we've been called. So you can get to see the activity that has happened here. So initially activity created gets to be called, and that gets to be called by an object Lifecycle Test 1. Then fragment created. So after we create our activity, we create a fragment. This is our Lifecycle Test fragment. So like version 1 of it gets to be called. Then the fragment, so within fragment we have an OnCreate, we actually have an OnCreate view. So fragments are slightly different. There's two sort of OnCreate methods. One when the fragment's initially created, and then OnCreate view for the fragment when it's made visible. So that gets to be called next, fragment view created. Then after we have created our activity, created our fragment, we then start the activity. So activity started happened, and starting the activity also starts the fragment that it contains. So we do that, then we resume the activity and resume the fragment. So that's the whole series of calls that go through that give us as programmers different points we can hook in to configure what happens when we're starting our activity, starting our fragment. Now, what I'm going to do here, you can see at the bottom, I'm going to basically hit the back key, and this will bring us back to the main menu. Now, the main menu here is an activity. Whenever I click on the Lifecycle Test, I get a second activity being generated. So that's important. So I'm going to click again on my Lifecycle Test, and it's going to bring me in, and you can see now we have an update to a bunch of text. Now, when we have a look at how the demo is written, you'll get to see it's a persistent display that it doesn't matter how many activities and fragments I create, I'm going to remember all of these and show a record of it. So let's have a look. Where we got to before was 7 lines down. Fragment resumed was the last message it displayed. When I hit the back key, we paused our fragment, paused our activity. They happened next. Then we stopped our fragment, stopped our activity. Because I was going back, basically I was discarding, throwing away that activity that I created, the one for our sort of lifecycle demo. Which means then I destroyed the fragment and I destroyed the activity. And important thing to note here, over on the right hand side of the demo we have Lifecycle Test 1, Lifecycle Test Fragment 1, and there's a whole bunches of ones all the way down. So that was the first incarnation of our Lifecycle Test activity and our Lifecycle Test fragment. You can now see a bunch of 2s appearing underneath that. And that's because whenever I clicked on the Lifecycle demo second time, I created a brand new activity because I destroyed the last one. So there we go through exactly the same phase: activity created, fragment view created, we started, we resume it, we add it in. Only difference this time is we now have number 2, so this is a completely separate object that was actually created. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to stop. I'm going to briefly suspend this. So I'm going to go out and maybe I'll just have a look at the applications that are here, and then going to actually go back into my demo. So what I did there was I didn't delete this activity, I just went off and did something else, then I came back to it. So we can have a look and see what happens here. So before I had got down to fragment resumed for Lifecycle Test Fragment 2, that was the last bit. Then I went back out. So effectively this resulted in the fragment and the activity being paused and also stopped. Now, it's still sitting there in memory. I've just gone off and done something else, but at that point it hasn't been kicked out of memory. whenever I came back then, so we don't have any destroy methods being created. So whenever I came back, we were able to start the activity, start the fragment. And if you check next to it, you'll see Lifecycle Test 2. So the activity in the fragment that we started was the second particular one, and then we resumed it and it carried on running. So for our game, for any app, when we're going through, creating these things, changing from one thing to the next, all of these methods are being called in the background, and they give us our opportunity then to actually control what happens within the application or the app. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a look at the code that underpinned all of this, and you'll want to go through that yourself, because in your game, some of these things you will want to get hooks into and to control. Just as a small aside, the next demo we'll look after this is going to be putting in a game loop, and the game loop will control the update and the draw, and that's going to be something we do want to hook into these things, that whenever the game is being stopped, we don't want our game loop running in the background. So let's have a look. We'll have a look at Lifecycle Test first of all. So this is basically an activity, a simple activity, nothing much more than that. What do we have within this? Well, at the top we have a private static int activity counter. And this is it's a static variable because every single time we create a new instance of this activity, we will increment that. So anytime we do an OnCreate, it'll be +1. When we do an OnDestroy, then we're going to remember whereabouts we were. So for the next OnCreate, we'll be able to increment this counter. So that's the thing that was doing initially. It was the first activity, then became the second activity, and so on. This little thing here, this single fragment activity class, basically it just sets up an activity that adds in a single fragment. So we have an overloaded method, create fragment, that adds in a new lifecycle test fragment. So that's just a little bit of setup. Now, what we have down here then is various bunches of methods. We have methods for create and destroy. So we have OnCreate, OnDestroy. We have methods for starting and stopping. So onStart, onStop. And we have methods for resume and pause, OnResume and OnPause. So that was the different lifecycle ones that we mentioned. So whenever we create something, for example, we increase our counter by 1, and we're going to call a notify method. And this notify method will log out to the screen activity created, and it'll also tell us the particular object that created that activity. So we'll know if it was the first activity, the second activity, the third activity, depending on which one we've created. And for good sake, because we are sort of hooking into this, but we don't want to change the default behavior, we call the superclass OnCreate. So do whatever we normally do on OnCreate. Ditto for the other ones. OnDestroy, we're logging out that we've been destroyed. OnStart, we're logging out that we're started. OnStop, similar pattern. OnResume and OnPause. So all we're doing there is simply just logging out whenever we get to be called, and that's that, nothing more than it. What else do we have in this here? We have our notify method. So this is the thing that gets to be called whenever we enter into those states. Now, just a little side in terms of this was Android programming here. When we notify it, we want to write something out. Where we want to write out to is to the text field, or the text view that is part of the fragment class. So this is the activity. So basically we want to get access to the fragment and tell the fragment to update itself with some new text. So that's what we're doing down here. In these two lines, we're basically going to our fragment manager and we're saying, okay, can you get me that particular fragment that you added to me? And then we're going to notify it with this object, whatever fragment we are going to be displaying, the event that's happened, if we've been created or destroyed, and true, I can't remember true actually, well, one of the properties in terms of the notify one. The toString method, we're overloading this here so that as opposed to returning the normal full toString, we're going to get the simple name of the class, which will be Lifecycle Test for this activity, and then to add on the activity counter. So simple class, a little bit of linkage with the fragment, but basically the things of interest here are our own create, OnDestroy methods where we log things out. Here's the Lifecycle Test fragment, which is a type of fragment. So we'll have a look what it does. Similar pattern to the previous one, we're adding in here a static counter so we can keep record of just how many fragments we're creating if we're going back into destroying a fragment, then have to recreate it. Similar to the other one, we've got OnCreate, OnCreate View, OnDestroy, OnStart, OnStop, OnPause, OnResume. So those are the methods that we are overloading. We have a little bit more to do here on the OnCreate view, because other than simply to note that it's happened, we do actually want to create a view for this fragment, so we're going to have to create the view in that as well. Let's start at the top. So OnCreate is the same as the activities one. We'll implement the counter, we'll notify that a fragment's being created, and we'll do whatever we normally would have done in an OnCreate. OnCreate view, so this is probably the important method here. This is the one that gets to determine what is displayed for that fragment. So the first thing we do is we call the notify method. So we say we've been called. We want to record that as well. Having done that, then we go to our layout file. We get the chunk of XML that describes what this should be like, and we inflate the thing. And basically within this, we're going to be finding view by ID. There is a text field, or text view rather, that we've declared within that chunk of XML. So we want to get access to that because that's what we will be displaying our text on. And here we're doing a little bit of an aside. So I'm going to briefly just zoom down to the bottom. You'll notice that there is a notify method here, and that notify method will actually, we'll look at this in a second, it's going to display the text. But what I'm doing down at this point is that whenever I'm creating the view for the fragment, stuff will have happened before that. The activity will have been created, the fragment will have been created, and then we'll call OnCreate view of the fragment. So I want to display those messages at the point that I've created the view of the fragment, so that something gets to be displayed on the screen. When I come into it, I can see what's happening. So that's basically what I'm doing. I'm displaying the text here, and that shows me all of the previous things that have happened that I wasn't able to display because the fragment didn't have its view yet created. OnDestroy, OnStart, OnStop, OnPause, OnResume, much the same as the previous one. They just simply log out they've been called. For the notify method, if I call notify here, so I've declared this as a static method. I have to do this as a static method in terms of the notify, because if we think about this, when we are creating our activity, at that point we haven't created a fragment, it doesn't exist, but we still want to have some way of recording that something has happened. So I've been slightly naughty. I put in a static method inside our fragment class here, so I can call it from anywhere and I can remember the different events that are happening. We're using a string builder within this, and here's the method down here. So we're going to call notify, pass in the activity, pass in the fragment. Now the fragment may not exist at this point, so it's a nullable thing, and we'll check that at the bottom. Pass in the string for the event, and then finally the boolean true or false at the end if it records if it was a message that came from the activity or a message that came from the fragment. What do we do within this? We have a little bit of string concatenation. Actually, not string concatenation, string building. We're avoiding string concatenation because it's slightly inefficient. So we'll use our string builder to basically to format this out. So we'll build up what was the class, what was the message that happened, and so on. And we're adding that into our log of activity for it. So we have one string that records all of these things that happened. And we're sort of also logging it out to the logcat2, just for a way of interest. The bit down here is the thing that tries to display it. And I say try because there's a few conditional things here. We have got to check, do we have a fragment? So when we call the activity OnCreate, we won't have a fragment at that point, so we can get as far as here, but we're not actually going to display anything yet. We also want to try to get the view to that fragment. Again, that's important because we'll call the fragments OnCreate, but we won't have a view at that point. It's only whenever we call the OnCreate view of the fragment that actually will have something we can use to view it. So it too is potentially nullable. Down here, this is where we have a fragment and it's created as view, Then we can get the text view that that fragment has, and we can set the text in it to the particular message that we have displayed. And again, we're very bottom, we're overloading our toString method within this class. So that's it. The actual hooks that we're getting into on pause, on resume, start and stop, create and destroy, they're very straightforward. And they really are opportunities to get in there to do things that are appropriate to it. The rest of this demo was just a little bit of Android plumbing, I suppose, in terms of how we can communicate from activities to fragments and so on and so forth. Next video, we're going to have a look at integrating a simple game loop, something that will tick and say update objects, draw objects, update objects, draw objects, and integrate it into this type of framework so that when we pause and resume that we're doing appropriate things in terms of that game loop. That'll be in the next video.